Good morning, everyone. Namaste. My name is Pragya Bhatt, and I'm a yoga teacher based in Bangalore. I've been teaching yoga and practicing yoga for more than a decade now. I'm happy to be here with you, albeit virtually. I'm actually filming this in a small village in the Himalayas, and you can probably see the Himalayas in the background, perhaps. Anyways, I look forward to being with you later this month for an in-person yoga session, but for today we're virtual. And let me share a PPT that I've actually created for our session. So here we are. So I'm going to be giving you a bird's eye view of the history of yoga and why it's relevant to us. So let's begin. So let's start with what is yoga? If I was there with you, I would have asked you this question and I would have waited to hear what your answers were. But since I'm not there, I've taken the liberty to compile a list of what I feel your answers would be and what I have heard from many different people throughout the years. Now, this list is not exhaustive, but a few things that you would have said would be things like it's an exercise or a workout, or it's a form of meditation, or it's an activity for a lot of you, or it's a yoga course, or it's a philosophy. Maybe it's a type of spirituality. You could associate it with a study or a practice, or a lot of people might even say that it's a state of being. Now, the fact that there is so many different kinds of answers for a single question demonstrates the complexity of the subject. Which of these answers is correct? Some of you might actually really believe that yoga is just a form of exercise, and you might not even know that it's a philosophy. Some of you might say, yes, I've done a yoga course in Rishikesh, but I don't practice yoga. So yoga is many different things to different people. And to try to define something like this, it's an exercise in futility. You can never actually define what yoga is. So instead of this, I believe we can try to understand the different dimensions or facets of yoga to gain real insight into what it is, rather than just looking at a definition, a superficial definition of what yoga is. So to gain an understanding, let's start with the history of yoga. The practice of yoga is very, very closely tied with the culture and religion of what is called the Indus Valley civilization. And in present day, in the world today, this region would be Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. In fact, this seal was discovered between 1928 to 29 at the site called Mohenjo-Daro, which is in present-day Pakistan. And we date this seal between 2350 and 2000 BCE. Why this is relevant to yoga is because this seal is known by three names. The first name is Mahayogi seal. Mahayogi because the figure appears to be seated in a yogasana, if you look carefully, and he has three heads. So Maha means great. So great yogi, Mahayogi, which is another name for Shiva. And Shiva is the Adi Yogi as well. The second name that we use for the seal is the Pashupati seal. Now, this figure is surrounded by animals, and Shiva is also depicted with animals. Pashu means animals, and Pashupati Nath is another name for Shiva. So again, there's a link to Shiva in that. And we also call it the Proto-Shiva seal. If you look at this figure closely, if you look at the lower body, it looks like it has an erect penis. And although many scholars have said that that's just an attachment of the garment that the figure is wearing, but a lot of people say that no, it is actually a phallus. And Shiva is actually represented by a phallus. If you've been to a Hindu temple, you would have seen the Shivling, and that's actually the lingam, the phallus of Shiva. And Shivling, the Shivling is actually a prototype of Shiva. Hence, we call this the Proto-Shiva seal. And for those of you who are interested in archaeology and museums, this is actually available in the National Museum in New Delhi for anyone who wants to actually go and see it. Yoga also is first mentioned in the Rig Veda around 1500 BC. And as yoga teachers and practitioners, we hear this a lot. We hear that That yuj, which is the root of the word yoga, is actually mentioned in Rig Veda, which is one of the oldest Vedas, the oldest Vedic literature. But the interesting thing is that the Rig Veda doesn't talk about yoga as we know it today. In fact, the Rig Veda doesn't say anything concrete about anything. All Vedic literature is actually just full of stories and metaphors, and they're told or written in such a way that they leave a lot of room for interpretation. So, and finally, we also know that yoga was, and it, for the large part, it continues to be a largely oral tradition. Now, from the history, let's come to yogic literature. Actually, it's from yogic literature that we piece together a history of yoga. So let's look at three important yogic texts and see what they tell us about yoga. So now, the first is the Rig Veda, which, as I said before, contains the word yuj, which means to yoke. We believe that the Rig Veda was composed between 1500 to 2000 BCE. And actually, the word yuj, the root yuj, occurs in many of the shlokas in the Rig Veda, and it refers to yoking or attaching yourself to the higher self. But in the Rig Veda, actually, it occurs in connection to horses and the yoking of horses. And the shloka that is the most significant is the one that talks about the god Indra, or rather, he was a demigod, Indra, yoking the horses and drawing them together like the rays of sunshine, so that there is a sort of dawn that happens in the absence of this light. And this dawn that occurred when Indra yoked the horses or yoked the sunshine symbolizes the dawn of enlightenment or the dawn of knowledge. Next is the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, which is a text that talks exhaustively about yoga and also gives us this definition. And the definition is Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, which means yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. And this is Sutra 1.2 of the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. And we're going to be looking at it a little more, the Yoga Sutras, a little bit more. These sutras were believed to have been compiled between 500 to 400 BC, and they're a collection of 196 aphorisms or sutras, and they're divided into 4 chapters. And Patanjali himself was born in 200 BC, and he was a man of many talents. He's credited with writing important texts, not only about yoga, but also about medicine and grammar. Then the Bhagavad Gita, finally the Bhagavad Gita, which is the most recognized text. It was compiled in the 2nd century BCE, and it gives us this definition: Yogaha karmashu kaushalam. Yoga is skill in action. And this is shloka 2.50 in the Bhagavad Gita. And the Gita is basically a conversation between Arjuna, who we believe was the greatest warrior in history, and Lord Krishna. And the Gita contains wisdom about the purpose of our existence, about the soul and the immortality of the soul, and also about our relationship with a higher power. So let's talk a little bit more about the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, because not only is it one of the key texts for yoga today, but it also talks about the Ashtanga Yoga, which is quite popular today, and many of you might have heard about it. Now, this is a stamp that the Indian government printed in tribute to Maharishi Patanjali. And so that's what he looked like. And you can see that we have a figure depicting yoga, literature, and Ayurveda. So sort of attributing all of these three to Patanjali. And so Patanjali divides his sutras into 4 chapters. And these are the Samadhi chapter, which talks about the results of yoga practice. So he begins by telling the seeker what they can expect if they start the practice of yoga. Then he has the sadhana chapter where he describes this yoga. Sadhana actually means discipline. So he describes the discipline of yoga. Finally, he has the Vibhuti chapter where he talks about the powers that you can gain through the practice of yoga. Vibhuti actually means power. And he's described a lot of superpowers like being able to fly, shape shift, make yourself really small or really big, etc., etc. And finally, he has the Kevalya chapter, where he starts to describe the process of liberation. Kevalya actually means a state of isolation or oneness. So when you actually remove all the external disturbances in your life and experience a state of oneness brought about by the practice of yoga. Patanjali also describes the 8 limbs or parts that comprise Ashtanga Yoga. Ashta means 8, and Anga means limbs in Sanskrit, and that's how you get the word Ashtanga. And so the 8 limbs are Yama, Niyama. So these are the practices that the practitioner has to begin with in yoga. So yama comprises of things such as ahimsa, which means non-violence, satya, which means truthfulness, asteya, brahmacharya, aparigraha. I believe that my colleagues will be taking you through these in their presentations. After yama, you have niyama. So these are like shaucha, which means cleanliness. So these are again things that you're supposed to practice before you can actually get deeper into the practice of yoga. Then you have asana and pranayama, which are one of the most recognized parts of Ashtanga Yoga. Then you have something called pratyahara. So he says that after you practice your yamas and niyamas, asana, pranayama, you can start to practice pratyahara, which means the withdrawal of the senses. Then he has dharana. So once you withdraw the senses, then you can start to concentrate because your senses are now in your control. And finally, after dharana, you can have dhyana, which is a state of meditation. So if you can concentrate for a long time, you can reach a state of meditation. And in the end, you gain samadhi, which is the goal of yoga, which is enlightenment. So if you can meditate for a long period of time, you can actually attain samadhi or enlightenment. So this was Ashtanga Yoga as codified by Patanjali, a step-by-step sequential process that he's actually written down. Now, in one of the previous slides, I mentioned the Bhagavad Gita and how it talks about the purpose of human existence and our relationship to God. So the Bhagavad Gita also defines 4 kinds of yogas, and these are Gyan Yoga, which is the yoga of knowledge. In the yogic tradition, we believe that you can know enlightenment through scriptural study. Then the Bhagavad Gita describes Karma Yoga, which is the yoga of action. Karma means action. In this path of yoga, you can know enlightenment by correct actions. And correct actions are actions that follow the code of conduct that is deemed right as per the scriptures of yoga. The Bhagavad Gita also talks about Raja Yoga. Raj means king. So this kind of yoga focuses on the control of the mind and the senses. And we actually believe that this type of yoga was the precursor to the modern form of physical yoga. In fact, Patanjali's yoga. And finally, the Bhagavad Gita also talks about Bhakti Yoga. Bhakti means devotion. So this is the yoga of devotion. So devotion to God or a higher power. And you can know enlightenment through this as well. And here is a picture of Ganesh transcribing the Gita. The story goes that there was a sage called sage Vyasa, and he dictated the Gita to Ganesh. And that's what you see in this picture here. Ganesh is the guy who actually transcribed the Bhagavad Gita. So that was a little bit about the ancient history of yoga. Now let's look at some teachers of note from more recent yoga history. And I've titled this as modern yoga teachers. But just for your information, modern yoga is actually defined as the time between 1700 and 1900 AD. But the teachers that I mentioned in this slide would actually be classified as postmodern because they're more in the last 100 to 200 years. Now, these are T. Krishnamacharya. He is actually known as the father of modern yoga, and he was the teacher to the big famous teachers such as B.K. Iyengar, T.K.V. Desikachar, Indra Devi, Patabi Joyce, A.G. Mohan. These were all students of T. Krishnamacharya. Next, I've mentioned Swami Kuvalyananda, and he's established an institute called Kevalya Dham in 1924. Kevalya Dham is a wonderful institute near Pune where they do some fabulous, really good quality scientific research on yoga. And I've been there, and I think it's worth a visit for anyone who's interested in yoga. I've also listed Swami Shivananda. Now, he's the founder of the Divine Life Society. He founded it in 1936. And he's also the founder of the Shivananda Ashrams. And a lot of you might actually know about Shivananda Ashrams. I've also mentioned Sri Aurobindo, who established Auroville near Pondicherry in 1926. And many of you might know Auroville, but you might not know that Aurobindo is also credited with founding a yoga called the Integral Yoga, which is still actually practiced in Auroville. Then I've put down TKV Desikachar, who was actually the son of T. Krishnamacharya. And he established the Krishnamacharya Yoga Mandiram as a tribute to his father in Chennai. And Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, many of you might be familiar with transcendental meditation, and he's the founder or inventor of that. And finally, I've also mentioned B.K. Iyengar, and he's the founder of the Iyengar style of yoga, which is the style that uses a lot of these props that many of you might have seen, blocks and chairs and ropes and things like that. And I'm a huge fan of B.K. Iyengar. I love the Iyengar approach to asana practice. And I have personally felt the impact of the Iyengar method. And during my session on the 23rd, I'll try and give you a peek into the practice. And hopefully you'll be able to experience what I'm talking about when I say that he's had a huge impact on me and my practice. Now, a few pictures to give you, some like faces to go along with the names. So T. Krishnamacharya, the father of modern yoga, that's him. And he's also the teacher of B.K.S. Iyengar. Now, this is Swami Kuvalyananda. He's the one who founded Kevalya Dham, where they're doing scientific research on yoga. And finally, this is B.K.S. Iyengar, and this is a famous picture of him doing the Shirshasana or headstand in front of the Eiffel Tower. So now let's talk about the importance of yoga today. And at the risk of sounding fanatical, I'm going to say that yoga is important for our survival as a species. Bear with me as I explain. So if you think about it, historically, our biggest threats have been natural calamities, such as floods or drought or famine, pandemics like the one we recently experienced. But historically, we've had the bubonic plague, Black Death, cholera, et cetera. But today, human beings are human beings' biggest threat. So we are a threat to ourselves. And that is because today there is a virus of lack of empathy and sympathy. We criticize too much. There's very little acceptance. Our collective mental health is at an all-time low. There is so much conflict, and there's very little tolerance. It seems to have gone down in the last couple of years. And to handle this, we need to be resilient people. And what is a resilient person? A resilient person is someone who has a strong body and a strong mind. And yoga is a holistic solution to all of these issues. I believe the practice of yoga can give you not only a strong mind, but also a strong body so that you can recover from things like COVID very quickly, or even the common cold or anything else really quickly. But a strong mind to be able to accept things, to be able to tolerate conflict, or to be able to see a solution to conflict, to empathize with your fellow human beings. So today, more than ever before, there is a need for a strong mind and a strong body. And I truly believe that yoga has the power to give you this. Now, the secret of happiness, and happiness is something that everybody wants. I believe the secret of happiness also lies in the practice of yoga. When I was doing my master's in yoga, one of my professors told us the story. And I think this story is very relevant to the kind of consumerist society we are today. And many of you would agree that we are consuming with a vengeance today. And why? Why are we consuming so much? Um, and the interesting thing is that with the acquisition or the consumption of more things and assets and wealth, we are also seeing an increase in mental health issues. People today, they're feeling more isolated. There is more depression and loneliness than ever before. And buying things and owning things does give us some happiness. And in fact, we even call it retail therapy. There's a sense of therapy associated with the acquisition of things. So we buy one house and then we want a vacation home in the hills, and then one in Goa, and then we want a farmhouse. The list is endless. Similarly, the first bite of some really exclusive chocolate, like the best Lindt chocolate around, is great. But the taste of the same Lindt chocolate, the 50th bite, the taste would have changed. My feeling towards the first bite, or the kind of feeling that it evokes, will be very different from the kind of feeling that the 50th bite of the same chocolate evokes. The same thing. My first house will give me a lot of happiness, but my 50th house, not so much. It's the same chocolate, it's the same house. So, happiness is not in the gulab jamun or the Lindt chocolate or the house or the mobile phone. Happiness is not contained in the things that we are buying. And happiness shouldn't be ephemeral. It shouldn't be that after I have, the first bite of gulab jamun, first bite of Lindt, that my happiness goes away. It should be a permanent state. So, one lesson is that we should not look for happiness in objects and things. And we need to start looking for happiness within us. And through the practice of yoga, we can actually attempt to live in a state of happiness, or at least contentment for the most part. Not 100% of the time, but for the most part. So that is the secret of happiness, not to look at happiness in external objects, but to look at it within. And yoga actually gives you a practice for doing that, for cultivating a happiness inside of you, for feeling fulfilled inside. And now, so we're almost at the end of our presentation. I'm sorry, we only had this much time for today, but I'd like to point out to you guys that we started with talking about references of yoga in texts dating back to 1500 BC. And today we are in 2023, and there is still, you would agree, a craze, an interest, a global interest in yoga. And this fact never ceases to amaze me. And the more I teach, the more I'm amazed and enamored by this powerful practice. It has remained relevant and versatile through the ages, because I feel that inherently there is a power in yoga that makes it versatile, that makes it relevant to everybody across cultures, across countries. It All human beings, if they practice yoga, can actually find a sense of purpose, a sense of peace in yoga. And I can say, even without being there with you, and or even knowing any of you personally, that you would have practiced, or even at least heard about one of these styles of yoga, you can say. I have a feeling that there will be very few people that we meet today who've never ever gone to a yoga class. There would be very few people. Most people that we meet today, have been to some sort of yoga class or another. So that in itself demonstrates to you that yoga is actually a very versatile subject, and it's a very versatile practice. And you around the world, we see tantra yoga, hatha yoga, power yoga, restorative yoga. All of these might be inventions of the 21st century, but the fact is that they are still based in text. They find their roots in texts that were written as far back as 1500 BC. And since we're talking about consumerism, consumerism actually also keeps yoga relevant. So now, today, you can get yoga pants. Keeps yoga very relevant, keeps it very present in our collective psyche. You can get yoga shoes. So Skechers actually has a yoga shoe. And you can even get yogi wine. So this is something that I think will excite a lot of you. So you see, consumerism is also impacted by the practice of yoga, and perhaps the practice of yoga is also impacted by consumerism. It's like a cycle. But the fact is, yoga is as relevant today as it has been, for centuries now, and it's not about to go away. So finally, what is yoga? So I know perhaps for a lot of you, there were a lot of things in this presentation. Maybe you're feeling a little overwhelmed by all the information that I've given you. I'm happy to share these slides with you so that you can look at them again, just to sort of take it at your own time. But I'd like to leave you with this question, or actually the answer to this question: what is yoga? So after all the study that I've done and continue to do, after all the practice that I've done and continue to do, if someone were to ask me what is yoga, I would tell them that yoga is a way of life. And I encourage you to actually look at yoga as that, as a lifestyle, as something that can promote peace, as something that can promote tolerance between human beings, as something that can actually enhance the quality of your life. And that brings us to the end of this presentation. This is a picture of two of my books. The first one is called Beyond Asanas. The second one is called In the Womb of the Goddess. And it was released earlier this year. And both books are available on Amazon. If you have any questions, please feel free to write to me on this email ID. You can also follow my blog, where I post interesting tidbits about my experiences with yoga, with travel, yoga and travel. And yeah, if you have any questions, I'm sure Namrata and Deepti can help you out. And if not, I will be seeing you on the 23rd or the 25th of March. And I'm always available at my email ID. So thank you for bearing with me. I hope this has shed some sort of light on the practice of yoga. And I look forward to being with you soon. Thank you so much. Namaste.